Hello, so we introduced the start of our buffer stock scheme diagram. So obviously, just to recap, obviously a buffer stock scheme is intended to stabilize the price of a commodity. Obviously, when we think about a commodity, we're thinking about raw materials, for example, agricultural products such as wheat. And we stabilize the price by buying excess supply when supply is high and then selling the stock on the market when supply is low. So that's how a buffer stock scheme works, and a buffer stock scheme is used to correct the market failure of price instability, also known as volatile prices. And we started to look at our diagram here. By no means is this the complete diagram, this is just the foundations of the diagram, and what we're going to focus on now is we're going to focus on analysing the diagram and explaining how a buffer stock scheme can be used to correct the market failure of price instability. So let's focus on our analysis. So if we have a look at our diagram so far, we have a supply of S2. And as we can quite clearly see, the quantity with S2 is significantly large. So we have a quantity of Q2 associated with the supply curve S2. And as we can see on our diagram, this quantity is very far from the origin. So S2 is going to be representative of a particularly good harvest. And obviously, when we're looking at this, we're going to be taking into account that we're focusing on an agricultural product. So S2 is going to be representative of a good harvest. So what do we see? Well, we see an equilibrium of Q2P2. But what does that mean, that equilibrium of Q2P2? Well, the price is below the minimum price. We can quite clearly see that the price P2 is below the minimum price. So this is where the buffer stock scheme kicks into action. So just revisiting our definition, in order to stabilize prices, the buffer stock scheme buys excess supply when supply is high. So we quite clearly see on our diagram, S2 is a particularly good harvest. There is high supply. The market equilibrium is Q2P2. We have a quantity of Q2 with a price of P2. The price is below the minimum price. As we discussed when looking at the market failure, that lower price is going to reduce the total revenue for farmers, which in this case are the producers. So obviously they're worse off due to this lower price. So the buffer stock scheme wants to make sure we stabilize these prices and make sure that farmers are not worse off. So we want to help and maintain the price between the minimum and maximum price. So what's going to happen? Well, the government intervenes. So there's government intervention. And what does the government do? The government buys up excess supply. So what does this mean, the government buys excess supply? Well, that artificially increases demand. So the government buying up the excess supply causes an increase in demand for wheat in this case. So it increases the demand, and that is going to increase from demand from D to D1. And we can therefore add in a new demand curve to our diagram. So let's add in a new demand curve. There we go. Oh, we can maybe just extend our supply curve just so it's not detrimental that happens, but we can just do that there. Okay, so we've added in a new demand curve representing the government buying up the excess supply, and we can label that D1, and we can draw an arrow out from D to D1. So what does that mean for our price now? Well, as we can see, if we move up the supply curve S2, we can see that the price has now risen from P2 to a new higher price. And we can label that price P3. So increased demand from D to D1 because the government's buying up this excess supply. We see a movement up the supply curve S2. So we move up the supply curve S2 as we do on our as we see on our diagram, and what that means is we have an increase price from P2 to P3. What does that mean for the price now? Well, that means the price is now within the upper and lower bound, i.e. it's between the maximum price and the minimum price. So that is a result that we wanted to achieve because we're looking to maintain the price within those limits in order to ensure price stability. Increased price P2 to P3 within, so price now within limits, and therefore achieving price stability. So we've shown there, when we've had a good harvest, a large supply, how a buffer stock scheme would work. Okay, so now let's focus on when there potentially is a poor harvest, for example. So if there is a poor harvest, that is going to be representative of S1. So we'll just put an arrow, to fit it all on this page, we'll just draw a line across there to separate that off, and we'll start our analysis over here. So S1 is representative of a poor harvest. So, for example, there may be some really bad climate. There may have been large amounts of flooding, which have ruined the crops. And as a result, there is therefore low supply. So S1 is representative of a poor harvest and a low supply. So as a result, okay, if we return to our original demand curve, if we had this particularly poor harvest, we are going to have a price of P1. So poor harvest, low supply, we have an equilibrium of Q1, P1. That price is above the maximum price. And what does that mean? Well, that means that consumers are now worse off. Their consumer surplus will have fallen. So therefore, we see a fall in consumer surplus because the price is above the maximum price. So what we want to do now is the government, with the buffer stock scheme, wants to therefore reduce this price instability, this volatile price. So what's the government going to do? Well, the government's going to intervene. So again, we've got government intervention. I'll just separate off before we carry on talking. We'll just separate off that point there with kind of a dashed element just to demonstrate that it's slightly separate, but it's still part of the analysis. So we've got government intervention. So what does the government do this time? Well, the government's going to release stock onto the market. Release stock previously bought onto the market. Okay, so by releasing stock that the government previously bought up onto the market, it's going to lead to an increase in supply. And what it's going to do, it's going to increase supply from S1 to S3. And we can add that new supply curve on to our diagram. So S3, and we'll label that Q3. Okay, so what do we see? So the increase in the supply from S1 to S3. So originally we were at our equilibrium point here, Q1, P1. This was above the maximum price, so the government now intervenes in the market. The government intervenes by releasing stock that they previously bought up onto the market. And by releasing stock onto the market, the supply increases. The supply increases in this diagram from S1 to S3. We see an extension along the demand curve. And what do we see? We see a decrease in the price from P1, and we're going to label this new price, and we're going to label that P4. Decrease the price from P1 to P4, and we see an increase in the quantity from Q1 to Q3. Okay, and as a result of this decrease in the price from P1 to P2, the price is now within the limits. It's now within the maximum price and the minimum price, and therefore achieving price stability. So price now within the limits, achieving price stability. So we can quite clearly see through explaining the diagram and using the relevant shifts in the demand and supply curves, we can see how a buffer stock scheme can achieve price stability and correct the market failure. So just to recap the key points here, we've got S2 representing a really good harvest, a really high supply, and as a result that unfortunately causes a particularly low price which negatively impacts upon producers. So the government intervenes to stabilise the price, and in doing so they buy up the excess supply, and as a result of buying up the excess supply, this causes an increase in demand, and therefore the price rises to within the necessary limits. However, if there is a poor harvest or a very low supply, the price is going to be particularly high, and that's going to fall again outside of the limits, so it falls above the maximum price. And as a result, consumers are going to be worse off. So what does the government do? The government intervenes. This time it releases stock onto the market. So the stock that it previously bought up, it now releases onto the market, increasing the supply. So we see an outward shift of the supply curve. And as a result of that increase in supply due to the release of stocks onto the market, we see the price fall, again, allowing us for the price to come now within the upper and lower limits, and therefore achieving price stability. So what this scheme does is it ensures that the price is constantly between the maximum and minimum price, and as a result, by the price being constantly between those two limits, it ensures price stability and therefore corrects the market failure.